The night over the steppe was unnaturally calm. Snowflakes drifted soundlessly through the fractured bones of buildings that once made up the outskirts of Stalingrad. To Lieutenant Otto Weber of the 71st Infantry Division, the silence felt wrong, like a predator holding its breath before the pounce. The city, which had screamed for months with artillery and fire, now slept beneath a white shroud. From his position inside a half-collapsed factory hall, Weber could make out the ghostly silhouettes of his soldiers, hunched against the cold. Their breath rose in pale plumes, like small souls escaping their bodies. They were exhausted, starved of sleep, food, and hope. The men whispered rumors. The Soviets were finished, out of manpower, out of strength. High Command had promised Stalingrad would be theirs. But Weber had eyes. He watched the distant steppe often, and in recent days he had seen movement, organized, purposeful movement. Headlights muffled, silhouettes shifting by the thousands, shapes that did not resemble retreat. The enemy wasn't dying, it was gathering. Inside his coat, Weber carried a small map stained with soot and oil. It showed their front stretched thin for miles, units from Romania guarding the flanks, poorly equipped troops holding positions far too wide. If a real push came, they would crumble like clay in the frost. He tried to dismiss the thought. After all, Field Marshal Paulus had assured Berlin that the Soviets were finished. "A few pockets of resistance," Goebbels said on the radio. "Victory is near." Yet Weber had seen Soviet eyes. In every skirmish among the ruins, their enemy fought like men defending not just the city, but existence itself. They crawled out of rubble, out of sewer tunnels, out of smoke, like the city was giving birth to soldiers. They did not break. They did not surrender. Outside, the winter wind changed, picking up, howling, pushing snow in frantic swirls across the wasteland. It rattled broken windows as if knocking for entry. Weber tightened his grip on his rifle. In the far distance, a murmur rose, metal against metal, engines rumbling under the earth, like an army waking up. Weber felt the cold crawl deeper into his bones. Something vast was coming. Something that would change everything. It began at 7:20. Not with the roar of engines or the march of boots, but with a single flash, distant, white, blooming along the horizon like a rising sun. Then came another, and another. A string of fire uncoiling across the steppe. The ground trembled. Seconds later, the sound arrived, a rolling thunder so enormous it shook rusted beams loose from the ceilings above Lieutenant Weber's head. Artillery. Hundreds of guns firing in a single unified scream. The world outside became a storm of fire and steel. Operation Uranus had begun. Soviet Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky had waited, gathered, schemed. And now the trap was sprung. The barrage was not aimed at the ruined city. It cascaded down instead onto the flanks where Romanian divisions shivered in shallow trenches with little more than rifles and old anti-tank guns to stop tanks. The men under those shells never stood a chance. Weber rushed outside into the blizzard of explosions. The sky flickered like lightning caught in a strobe. Flames erupted on the horizon, too many to count, marking positions where Allies fought desperately to hold the line. But through the smoke came the deep, rhythmic thunder that German veterans feared most. Tanks. Soviet T-34s, KV-1s, and self-propelled guns advanced in waves. Infantry clung to their flanks, silhouettes cutting through the fiery haze like an endless tide. The rumble shook the frozen earth beneath Weber's boots. A messenger sprinted toward him, sliding on snow. "Romanian front collapsing!" he shouted over the bombardment. "Enemy breakthrough! Massive!" Weber's heart sank. High Command had insisted those positions were secure. They were wrong. A Romanian soldier stumbled past, uniform scorched, face gray with terror. "Too many!" he cried in broken German. "They come everywhere, everywhere!" Weber grabbed his shoulders, trying to steady him, but the man was already gone, running back into the ruins as if demons chased him. The radio crackled in the bunker behind them, frantic voices overlapping. "Enemy armor, hundreds, flank compromised. Request immediate reinforcements. They're surrounding us." Surrounding. The word lodged in Weber's mind like a shard of ice. The plan, he realized, was larger than smashing the defense. This was a pincer. A closing fist. The frozen silence of the previous night had not been peace. It had been the inhale before a deadly blow. By midday, fear spread faster than the Soviets. Reports poured in, each more unbelievable than the last. Enemy tanks had carved through the Romanian lines north of the city. Another breakthrough thundered across the southern steppe. The pincers of a steel trap were now swinging inward, and every German officer who saw the arrows on the map understood the same thing. If the Soviets linked up, the 6th Army would be sealed inside Stalingrad. In the command post, Major Reinhold Hauser stared at the situation bored with a hollow expression. He and other staff officers pushed markers back and forth, but the red arrows continued to surround them like predators stalking a wounded beast. Field Marshal Paulus entered, pale as the snow outside. He leaned over the chart, his finger trembling slightly as it traced the Soviet advance. "How did we allow this?" he whispered, though he already knew the answer. Arrogance. Supply shortages. The refusal to pull back. The blind belief that Hitler's will alone could reshape reality. Suddenly the radio man shouted, "Sir, urgent traffic from General Strecker." Hauser snatched the headset. After a moment his face tightened. "Kalach Bridge, lost." The room fell silent. Kalach was the lifeline. The only major crossing for retreat, for fuel, for ammunition, for hope. With it gone, the 6th Army was increasingly a prisoner of geography. Outside, soldiers huddled in shattered buildings, their breath fogging the air. They knew little of strategy, but instinct screamed that something terrible was happening. Tanks were now appearing in places they never should have been. Rumors circulated that entire battalions were missing, swallowed by the snow. A medic passed Hauser near the entrance. His bandages were stained red, his eyes redder. "We're setting up aid stations in basements now," he said quietly. "There are too many." The officer nodded stiffly, but the words burned. Too many. Casualties piling up faster than they could be carried away. Outside, smoke smeared the sky black. The temperature continued to fall. As dusk approached, Weber stood beside the remnants of his platoon. He could feel the panic rising in the men, see it in their trembling hands and the way they stared westward, as if salvation might come from that direction. A sergeant muttered a desperate prayer into his scarf. Weber didn't interrupt. Because, for the first time, he wanted to pray too. "They're closing the ring," whispered a soldier beside him, voice cracking. Weber said nothing. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. Night brought no rest, only dread. German headquarters at Golyabinsky was in chaos. Officers rushed between radios, desperately seeking updates from units that were vanishing by the hour. The Soviet advance was no longer a rumor. It was a shrinking circle of fire. Finally, the order from Berlin arrived. Officers read it once. Then twice. None could believe it. Hitler had commanded, "No retreat. The 6th Army will hold its positions. Stalingrad must not be abandoned." Major Hauser slammed his fist against the table. "We must break out now, while we still have the chance." General Schmidt, Paulus's chief of staff, shot him a warning glare. "We obey." "We die," Hauser corrected, voice low, bitter. Even Paulus's face betrayed turmoil. He had already prepared a breakout plan. Fuel stocks had been quietly collected. But with one message, the plan was erased. Hitler insisted that the Luftwaffe would supply everything by air. It was a fantasy no sane commander believed. Weber and his men gathered in their frozen strongpit, a ruined schoolhouse where chalk dust mixed with gunpowder. They listened as their lieutenant read the order aloud. "Hold. Hold against a storm of armor. Hold with dwindling ammunition. Hold with no escape." "Does the Führer know what it's like out here?" one soldier asked bitterly. Weber didn't answer. He couldn't. In the early hours of November 20th, fresh bombardments shook the city. Soviet troops pushed deeper into the flanks, tightening the encirclement. Command posts scrambled to reposition what little armor remained, Panzer IVs struggling through deep snow and burnout streets. Weber stared at the stars, cold, uncaring. He thought of home, of his mother's warm kitchen, of the river he used to swim in summer. It felt like a different universe. A dream fading in the chaos of war. A young private shivered violently. "We won't get out of here, will we, sir?" Weber placed a gloved hand on his shoulder. "We'll survive tomorrow first," he said. But even he heard the lie in his voice. The ring was nearly closed, and they were trapped inside. By the night of November 21st, the worst fears of every German officer solidified into fact. Soviet spearheads advancing from the north and south met at the small town of Savitsky, west of Stalingrad. Soldiers from each front embraced, cheering through the smoke and snow. Red flags were raised. Flares streaked into the sky, bright red against a black horizon. The encirclement of the 6th Army was complete. Over 250,000 Axis troops, Germans, Romanians, Italians, Croatians, were now trapped. A massive force, once unstoppable, had become prey caught in a steel noose. Inside the city, the news spread like wildfire. Weber felt the shift immediately. The atmosphere changed. Hope drained from faces like blood from a wound. Even veterans, men who'd fought in France and the Balkans without flinching, looked shaken. In the command bunker, Paulus stood grimly before his staff. The map on the wall had become a death warrant. He removed his glasses, rubbing his exhausted eyes. "The Fuhrer believes we can be supplied by air," he said quietly. "We will comply." But his voice wavered. Everyone knew the Luftwaffe could barely sustain a fraction of what was needed. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies. There was no miracle coming. Winter tightened its grip, plunging temperatures far below freezing. Soldiers burned furniture, books, even door frames just to stay warm. Weber shared a ragged blanket with 3 men in his platoon. One of them, a corporal named Kruger, stared into the flickering candlelight. "My brother is somewhere out there," he murmured, pointing toward the west. "We were supposed to meet after the war." Weber didn't ask if he thought such a day would ever come. Above them, Soviet artillery lit the skyline again, thunder crashing like the wings of some monstrous bird. In the distance, the sound of engines echoed, Soviet tanks repositioning, readying for the next push. Supplies dwindled. Spirits withered. The ring constricted. On the evening of November 22nd, Weber searched the sky for German transport aircraft. Just one would have lifted morale. Just one. But the sky was empty. The reality settled in like frost in the bones. Stalingrad was no longer a battlefield. It was a grave. And they were still breathing inside it. The winter of 1942 showed no mercy. Nights reached -30 degrees Celsius. Wind howled through cracked walls, slicing through wool and skin alike. Frostbite blackened fingers that once loaded rifles with ease. The 6th Army had entered a new phase of war, not one of bullets and tanks, but of starvation and disease. Inside a shattered apartment block, Weber's men huddled around a tiny fire fed with broken furniture. Their breath fogged thick in the air, a reminder that warmth was now a luxury. The food ration had shrunk to a crust of bread and a ladle of watery soup, sometimes flavored with sawdust to stretch supplies. Kruger gnawed his portion slowly, eyes hollow. "They say some units are butchering horses now," he said. "We're lucky," Weber replied. "We still have ours alive." But he glanced toward the building's rear courtyard, where the last horse shivered, ribs visible beneath thinning fur. The animal was once their lifeline, hauling ammunition and wounded men. Now it was one step away from becoming dinner. German radios crackled with empty promises. "The airlift continues," officers insisted. "Reinforcements are coming." But each day, fewer planes appeared. And each day, more men froze to death before dawn. In a basement converted into a hospital, the air smelled of iodine, blood, and despair. Wounded men lay packed together like cordwood on the floor, some coughing, others whispering names of distant family. A doctor worked with trembling hands, rationing bandages and morphine like gold. Weber visited one of his soldiers, a young Bavarian named Lucas. A sniper's bullet had torn through his shoulder, and infection was setting in. His skin burned with fever, eyes distant. "I'm sorry, sir," Lucas whispered. "I wanted to see home again." Weber knelt beside him, gripping his hand. "You will," he lied softly. "You will." Outside the basement, snow buried the wreckage of vehicles that once roared with purpose. Rust crept across steel like decay itself. The Red Army had slowed their attack now, conserving strength. Why rush? The Sixth Army was dying without them firing a shot. Weber looked toward the burning skyline, where Stalingrad's ruins glowed like embers in an endless night. "They don't need to kill us," he murmured bitterly. "The cold will do it for them." And in his heart, he wondered if Berlin even cared. Days passed like months. Word filtered through the ranks of a rescue attempt. Army Group Don, led by Field Marshal Manstein, was assembling to break the encirclement. Tanks, artillery, fresh divisions, or so the rumors said. Soldiers clung to those whispers the way drowning men cling to driftwood. In the command bunker, officers hovered over maps yet again. A possible breakout corridor toward Kotelnikovo appeared, a gap, thin but real. Even Paulus allowed himself a rare flicker of hope. "If we strike west with all available armor," Hauser insisted, "we can meet Manstein halfway. We must act before we are too weak to move at all." But the answer was the same, delivered like iron. "Hold Stalingrad." Hitler would not permit retreat. Not one step. The city bearing Stalin's name must be taken, or defended, no matter the cost. The Sixth Army was a symbol, and symbols were not allowed to withdraw. Weber heard the decision secondhand and felt the hope inside him curdle into anger. "We should be fighting toward rescue," Kruger muttered. "Instead we wait to die." Weber couldn't disagree. Outside, the sky was split by engines. Men ran outside, staring upward. A Luftwaffe transport staggered through the clouds like a wounded bird, its wings trembling under the weight of supplies. Soldiers waved, cheering, desperate. Then black puffs of flak burst around it, Soviet anti-aircraft fire. One wing dipped. Flames licked the fuselage. The transport spun, screaming toward the earth. It crashed in a distant fireball. The cheering fell silent. A medic near Weber muttered, "If even the planes can't get in." Weber felt himself sinking into despair he could no longer hide. He turned to see Lucas being carried away under a thin sheet, his final breath exhaled earlier that morning. Snowflakes fell on the cloth, melting into tiny dark spots. In the distance, Soviet loudspeakers crackled to life, their broadcasts drifting through the ruins in mocking tones. "German soldiers, surrender! You are surrounded! No one is coming for you!" Some soldiers cursed. Others bowed their heads. Weber clenched his jaw hard enough to hurt. "We hold," he whispered, though the word tasted like poison. For the first time, the men around him did not echo it back. They no longer believed. By December's end, even the most loyal officers could not deny the truth. Artillery fire continued to pound the shrinking German pocket, carving out more ruins in a city already dead. Ammunition ran so low that soldiers counted each bullet like a precious relic. Many rifles had become nothing more than clubs. In the command headquarters beneath a destroyed grain silo, Paulus stood hunched over the map table. His uniform hung loose. He had lost weight rapidly. His eyes looked sunken, exhausted by endless nights of despair. General Schmidt approached quietly. "The men, they need something, sir. Even a false promise of relief." Paulus stared at the map, silent. He had believed once. He had believed in Germany's military genius, in his soldiers' strength, in the possibility of victory. But belief meant nothing now. The Soviet ring was iron. Every attempt to widen it had failed. Manstein's offensive, their last hope, had been pushed back. The truth pressed down like the rubble above their heads. Stalingrad was lost. The Sixth Army was doomed. Weber sat with his platoon in a bombed-out cellar. No one spoke. They listened to the distant, constant drum of artillery. The horse was gone now, its sacrifice allowing them to eat one more day. But hunger returned instantly, gnawing at their stomachs like rats trapped in the darkness. Kruger broke the silence. "What will they write in the history books?" he asked, eyes fixed somewhere distant. "Will they say we were fools? That we died for nothing?" Weber didn't know. He thought of Lucas, buried in the snow. He thought of the Romanian soldier who ran into the darkness on the first day of the Soviet offensive. He thought of the sky, so wide and unreachable. "I hope," he said quietly, "they say we fought for each other." Kruger nodded. For the first time in days he smiled, small and tired. That would be enough. Outside, Soviet loudspeakers began again, their voices echoing across the ruins. "Lay down your arms! The officers have abandoned you!" But the men no longer reacted. They had heard it too many times. And worst of all, it no longer sounded like a lie. Weber looked at his hands, shaking, frostbitten, empty. He finally understood what every German commander knew now. There would be no breakout. No rescue. No victory. Only survival, if fate allowed it, and the bitter knowledge that this was the moment the Reich's dream began to crumble into dust. The first sunrise of January 1943 brought no warmth. Just a gray, suffocating silence. Soviet artillery strikes slowed. Ammunition was not wasted. The Red Army could wait, and starvation would finish what shells could not. In the distance, Russian soldiers stood atop captured positions, watching, patient as winter itself. Inside the headquarters, Paulus received a final message from Hitler, another demand for unconditional stand fast. But those words now felt detached from reality, written by a man who commanded from heated rooms far away from the frozen tomb Stalingrad had become. Paulus's hand hovered over the paper, then dropped. His voice cracked as he addressed his staff. "We can no longer conduct meaningful operations. Our men deserve a chance to live." The officers said nothing. They all knew what this meant. Surrender. The word that had been forbidden, cursed, unimaginable, was now the only path left that was not paved entirely with corpses. Down at the front, Weber watched as a group of gaunt soldiers tore strips of cloth to fashion white flags. His heart twisted. He had once believed himself invincible, part of the mightiest army Europe had ever seen. Now, he was just a man trying not to die in a ruined city far from home. Kruger stepped beside him, voice no more than a breath. "So, this is it." Weber closed his eyes. "Yes." All around them, Germans emerged slowly from holes in the ground, from ruined factories, from the skeletons of buildings that once reached for the sky. Hands raised. Helmets discarded. Rifles abandoned in the snow. Silence rolled across the battlefield. Not peace, just the absence of war. Weber stared toward the frozen Volga, its surface unmoving like the fate that had sealed around them. He thought of the road that had led them here: ambition, obedience, pride, lies. For the first time, he allowed himself to face the truth every commander knew on November 19th. Stalingrad was lost the moment they refused to retreat. A Soviet officer approached with a stern expression, pistol at his side. Weber lifted his trembling hands higher. Behind the officer marched rows of soldiers, well-fed, determined, victorious. They had survived the unthinkable and come out stronger. Weber whispered to himself, voice barely audible. "This is how the war ends. One frozen defeat at a time." As the Soviets took them into captivity, the bitter wind howled through the ruins, carrying away the last echo of a dream that had promised glory and delivered only graves.